This week on Talking Real, we have special guest Casey Ross with the Oklahoma City University School of Law join us to talk about the McGirt versus Oklahoma case that just came out. This is the case that dealt with tribal lands and Indian land in the eastern half of Oklahoma and whether that land becomes a reservation and what that means.
So join us for this fascinating journey into Oklahoma history and its future.
Welcome back to Talking Real, brought to you by the Oklahoma Association of Realtors. This is episode 142 of Talking Real, and this is kind of an interesting episode we got today, Nabil. I'm pretty excited, but first, how's your day?
Day's going well. This is obviously not the same day that we recorded this episode.
Right. So we recorded with Casey Ross, and Casey is the director of the American Indian Law and Sovereignty Center at the Oklahoma City University School of Law. I think if I recall, she actually said that she's the general counsel for Oklahoma City University as well.
Yes.
So she's got a big job there, but she joined us to talk about the McGirt versus Oklahoma case, which is the case that deals with the big portion of eastern part of Oklahoma. And you've heard much about this, about it potentially becoming Indian reservation land and kind of what that means. And so we talked to her. We had a great recording with her and has a lot of fantastic information. And so pretty excited to have this discussion to give you her perspective and some thoughts on that, how it could affect property and just a little overview of the case.
Right, because I remember when the case was first, brought to the public, everyone was like, "What's going to happen with this?" And lots of things snowball while you talk about them. But I think she puts everything into very good perspective.
Yeah, and I think that things are going to change. In fact, since we recorded this, I've seen some things that have come out from the Oklahoma Tax Commission that are raising some concerns about tax collections. I've seen some issues dealing with gaming, so casinos and those kinds of things that are raising some questions about how things are going to develop. There's a lot of factors to be worked out for sure, and I think we're going to continue to see some obstacles that will have to be dealt with coming up. But I think it was great to have Casey joining us and have her perspective and have some discussion on it. And so I hope that you find this really valuable.
Right. I don't think anything has changed since we had our conversation with her. It was a couple weeks ago, but let's jump right to it.
Let's do it. We're joined here on Talking Real podcast by Casey Ross. And Casey, she's the director of the American Indian Law and Sovereignty Center at the Oklahoma City University School of Law. And we're about to get in the weeds on McGirt versus Oklahoma. I'm really excited about this. Just been waiting for this episode to record it. So Casey, how are you today?
I am doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being on.
Yeah, we've had a bunch of realtors asking us about this case, and I'm, for a lot of them, the lawyer that they know, but this is so far outside of my wheelhouse that I have to say, I don't know, but let's find somebody who can help us understand what has happened in McGirt v. Oklahoma and what that might mean for real estate. And so we tracked you down, and we are so thankful that you have agreed to give us a little bit of time to talk about this today. So tell us, we mentioned what your title is and where you work, but with respect to kind of McGirt v. Oklahoma and these types of issues, tell us a little bit about your background in that area of law.
Sure. So I am a faculty member at Oklahoma City University School of Law, and I oversee our American Indian Law program. So when I was in law school, I kind of specialized in the study of federal Indian law. My first job out of law school, I worked for my own tribe. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. And since I started practicing law, I have always worked in Indian country with Indian law issues. So not only do I have experience practicing in the area, but I also am fortunate to have the opportunity to teach future lawyers about Indian law and try to turn out as many good lawyers here in the state and in the region who will go out and practice Indian law. So I've had a lot of time to study in this area, and Oklahoma Indian country is just a really interesting legal dynamic because it's a little different here than it is in most states. So when we think about Oklahoma, it's important to understand that the land base here is somewhat different than what you might encounter in other states. And the reason for that is because of the history of tribes here in what is now the state of Oklahoma. You're not going to know a lot of this because we don't do a good job of teaching this in our public school system. I do a little, icebreaker whenever I start my classes, and I ask my students, how many of you went to high school here in the state of Oklahoma? And most of them will raise their hand. And I'll say, okay, how many of you, because you were a high school student in the state of Oklahoma, were required to take a course called Oklahoma history? And they all raise their hands. And then I say, how many of you had Oklahoma history taught to you by a coach? And most of them raise their hand then too, right? And that's not to bag on.
I think it was like 7th grade too. I mean, it was
right. And not at all to bag on coaches. Some of the best instructors I had in high school were coaches, but a lot of times we see the curriculum just not being developed enough for any teacher to be able to adequately communicate what that history looks like. So here in what is now the state of Oklahoma, tribes were granted reservations through a variety of different mechanisms, some by treaty, some by executive order. But at some point prior to the state of Oklahoma becoming the state of Oklahoma, there was a federal policy to allot those reservations. So you'll hear Oklahoma referred to as a checkerboard of Indian land and non-Indian land. And that's really just a reference to that allotment process where the federal government came in and basically drew lines up and down a reservation and across a reservation to create a checkerboard pattern. And what they did was they allotted individual parcels of property to individual Indian people to make those native folks property owners. It was part of the assimilation effort. But any parcel of property that wasn't allotted to a specific individual Indian was then opened up for non-Indian settlement, which resulted in really a checkerboard pattern of Indian-owned parcels and non-Indian-owned parcels. So because we have that allotment history here in Oklahoma, Oklahoma just is a little different from an Indian country definitional perspective. So what we have in the McGirt case is we have the Supreme Court taking a really hard look at one reservation here in the state of Oklahoma. The McGirt case involves Muskogee Creek Nation's reservation. So when the Supreme Court had occasion to look at the history of that tribe's reservation, the Supreme Court had to make a determination as to whether or not that reservation had ever been disestablished. When we use the word disestablished, it's a legal term of art. It comes to us from a variety of Supreme Court cases that predate McGirt, where the Supreme Court has had to look at other reservation-based communities in other states to determine whether the reservation had been disestablished. And from those cases, we have an articulated standard, right? The Supreme Court says, hey folks, if there's a reservation, the only way it's going to be disestablished is if there is clear evidence that it was intentionally done by Congress. So when McGirt made its way up to the Supreme Court looked at that legal history of Muskogee Creek Nation's reservation. And what the court was looking for was clear, unequivocal language from Congress that said this reservation is disestablished. The Supreme Court didn't find that clear language that's required. And the Supreme Court's analysis resulted in a finding that the Muskogee Creek Nation reservation has in fact never been disestablished and remains fully intact as a reservation, not just a checkerboard of allotment pieces of property.
That is, like the history you mentioned is something that people don't see, unless you've really dug into it. And of course, like you said, you've got particular expertise and experience in, Native Indian law, and that's a very specialized area of law. Like that's not something that your average lawyer is going to know. I mean, I never had a class on that in law school, even going to law school here in Oklahoma. So it's a very interesting area of law, and is very complicated because you're talking about, if we're having to disestablish these reservations, I mean, this is going back 100 years now. They're having to review congressional records and those kinds of things, right? I mean, we're talking about early 1900s, right?
Right. And it's good to really hone in on that because it becomes relevant when we start talking about how this case might operate in other tribal communities, right? But if you look at the Supreme Court opinion, and really, if you want to geek out completely, go ahead and look at the underlying case that came before McGirt, which is Murphy, okay? Murphy went through the 10th Circuit and then up to the Supremes, but the Supreme Court couldn't get a 5-4 majority vote. They were tied at 4-4 because Gorsuch had recused himself because he was on the 10th Circuit when it came there, so he recused himself at the Supremes. But if you look at that 10th Circuit opinion in Murphy, it's a forever long opinion, but they go painstakingly through every congressional act that has dealt with Muskogee Creek Nation's reservation. And that painstaking analysis is really what's required for this claim to be made by any other tribe.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So, when this first came out, the kind of broad sweeping statements that were made, I mean, it was almost, oh my gosh, everything's upside down. The world is ending in the eastern half of Oklahoma. We don't know what's going on. But the actual McGirt case was very limited in its scope. Now, maybe there are things down the line that this could lead to, and we'll talk about that. But give us an idea of what is the specific issue, because you mentioned that, first of all, it only dealt with the Muskogee reservation. It's not all of them. Now, granted, by implication, this same issue may apply to other reservations that weren't disestablished correctly in the eastern half of Oklahoma. But and what was the actual kind of underlying issue in McGirt? It wasn't specifically about, they weren't challenging necessarily the idea that the reservation still existed specifically, but wasn't this like a criminal case that they were looking at?
That's right. So this is a criminal jurisdiction in Indian country case. And when I teach criminal jurisdiction in Indian country in federal Indian law, it's a semester-long course. I spend about 6 weeks teaching criminal jurisdiction. So it's a complex area of Indian law, and Indian law is already complex on its own, right? But really, there are rules for which sovereign has the authority to prosecute a particular criminal matter. And those rules change depending on the status of the property. If the status is Indian land, right? If the crime is committed on Indian land, Indian country, as defined by federal statute, then, a different sovereign has the authority to prosecute than if the crime is committed outside of Indian country. So in McGirt, we had a situation where there was a criminal defendant accused of committing a crime, and the state prosecuted that native defendant. The native defendant came in and made the claim that the state did not have authority to prosecute him under those criminal jurisdiction rules, and said that instead it should have been a federal prosecution because his claim was this crime occurred on Indian country land, right? So it really did come up as a result of more criminal procedure origins, but the claim that was made about the reservation status of the land where the crime was committed led to this Indian law decision that kind of falls outside the scope and is broader than just a criminal law case.
I have to say there's some incredibly clever lawyering going on there to even, I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, they had to have put in a lot of work to go back and figure that out for sure. I want to switch gears a little bit then. And so we've kind of laid the foundation of what this case was about. We're talking about all these lands in eastern Oklahoma and kind of assume that it's all these reservation lands, which includes Tulsa metro area, for example, a huge swath of eastern and southeastern Oklahoma. And so a lot of the questions that we've been getting deal with, well, how does this affect real estate? So people who own real property in these areas that are kind of, I'm going to say under dispute, I don't know that that's the right word, but these relevant areas that we're talking about are people that want to buy property. What are the issues that they're looking at right now? Because there's been some concern of, does this mean that we need to hold off on buying property or what's going on? So I'm curious to kind of hear your takes. I know this case doesn't deal with those specific issues. This is a limited issue, but has there been any discussion or speculation about what this may look like for real estate in those areas?
Sure. So I have a couple of PSAs. Number one, I really encourage folks not to get any of their news or advice from social media, because what I saw when these cases were making their way through the system, what I saw, I mean, I'd be on Facebook and I'd see some inflammatory kind of the sky is falling narrative that would take hold, where you had folks saying, the tribes are going to own all of the land in Oklahoma and you're not going to have your land anymore. People are, going to lose their property. I want to make it very clear that nothing about the McGirt decision impacts in any way private land ownership, even inside of a reservation. So individual landowners are still going to own their property. It's still going to be fee status property. It just happens to be inside of a reservation boundary. And I know that that seems a little bit new for the approach here in Oklahoma, just because this clarification took a long time to get, right? It's been done wrong for so long. When it finally gets fixed, it feels a little new. So I know it seems a little bit new here in Oklahoma, but I would just counsel folks, keep in mind there are reservations in other states outside of Oklahoma. There are parcels of fee property inside of those reservations that have coexisted for decades and decades and decades. So while it might seem a little new here, it's not new from a national perspective. And private property owners really don't need to freak out at all as it relates to their property interests as a result of the Supreme Court decision.
That's going to be good news for everybody that's,
Sure.
that was concerned about that. What other issues do you think will start to arise from this? Because it seems to me that there may be some other jurisdictional type issues that will come up. I don't know if there's anything else pending as a result of this, or that's still, new issues that are out there, or what we are sort of foreseeing coming in the future. Any idea what other kinds of interesting issues we will come across?
I mean, most of the discussion that I've seen as it relates to real property issues, right? Obviously, folks having questions about whether they still own their property. And of course, the answer to that is yes, you still own your property. But I've seen some traffic back and forth about whether individual fee property is still subject to state taxation, right? Is my real property still going to be on the tax rolls? The answer is yes. Okay, there's nothing about this decision that impacts the state's ability to tax fee land inside of a reservation. But outside of real estate, we really start to see these other considerations. Obviously, there's going to be a shift in the way that crimes are prosecuted inside of the reservation. Doesn't mean there's going to be more cases. It just means that the sovereign with the authority to prosecute those cases is going to shift in some of those cases from the state and over towards a federal prosecution authority or a tribal prosecution authority, or sometimes both of those, right? So criminal prosecution, obviously going to be managed a little different with that shift. I've seen a lot of traffic about a tribe's ability to exercise civil authority over individuals inside of the reservation. I'll tell you that when I teach civil jurisdiction in Indian country, it takes about 6 weeks as well. And when we look at civil jurisdiction, it's a totally different set of rules than we learn on the criminal jurisdiction side of things. But when we look at civil jurisdiction, we have a lot of Supreme Court cases that we weave together to come up with what the rules are. And as a general matter, the Supreme Court has said that tribes have limited authority over non-members of their tribe. So as far as a tribe exercising regulatory authority or even adjudicatory authority, having people come into the tribal court system for claims that they might have thought should have gone to the state, I'll tell you that those Supreme Court rules really have crafted a general approach, which is that tribes are somewhat limited in their civil authority over non-members. That being said, I'll say I've seen some folks concerned about the idea of litigating in tribal court. I'll just put in a plug for tribal courts, y'all. Tribal courts are great courts, okay? They're entirely competent. They're sophisticated courts. They have wonderful judges, wonderful staff, good sets of laws and procedures. It shouldn't be something that folks are completely freaked out and afraid of. I always advocate for people having faith in a tribal court system just as much as you'd have faith in any other type of sovereign's court system. They're legitimate, they're competent, they're sophisticated, and I don't think folks should be completely freaked out of, going into a tribal court setting.
I think that's kind of an interesting point. I've never personally had to appear in a tribal court or anything like that, so that would be a new experience for me. But much like anything, whether it's a lot of our members are familiar with like an arbitration. So here at our association, in fact, we arbitrate commission disputes and other contractual disputes amongst our realtor members. And so in much the same way, it's an alternative. It's just a different kind of court system where we actually have a hearing and all those kinds of things. So at least for our members, it would be sort of similar to that. It doesn't have to be in district court in Oklahoma County or wherever. It's just a different court system. So, but still bound to rules and due process and all those kinds of things. So really kind of interesting. So to kind of wrap up, I'm just wondering if you had any other closing thoughts on this, maybe some advice for our realtor members if they have concerns from clients of theirs, perhaps, that have heard about it. What do you kind of think they should be saying? I mean, you sort of mentioned that there's really no concern for people who are buying property or who own property. I mean, you're not going to have your property come and taken away by a tribe or anything like that. Is there anything that you would recommend our members point people to, or just some advice on allaying those fears for people?
Sure. So I think it's important for everyone here in Oklahoma to understand that this case deals specifically with Muskogee Creek Nation. There are going to be other tribes who make the same type of claim and argument based on their community. We've already seen the McGirt opinion used as binding precedent, even outside of the state of Oklahoma. But we've seen an opinion out of the district court in Seminole County, a decision that indicated that Seminole Nation is also a reservation that has not been disestablished. Obviously, when we talk about Eastern Oklahoma, we're looking at large land bases of the 5 tribes, which include the Muskogee Creek Nation, Seminole Nation, Chickasaw Nation, Choctaw Nation, and Cherokee Nation. And those 5 tribes have very similar allotment histories and similar statutes that led up to their allotment. So if I had to bet, I would say that the other 4 of the 5 tribes have the most similar legal claims to make that would pair with McGirt, which recognize Muskogee Creek Nation's reservation boundary. But that's not to say that other tribes here in the state don't have the same claim. So there may be tribes all over the state of Oklahoma and outside of the state of Oklahoma in Indian country who are making claims based on this McGirt decision. So as those work their way through their own painstaking analysis, right, we're likely to see additional claims made and additional decisions that fall in line with what the McGirt case decided. So while it's not decided right now, I think realtors in Oklahoma need to understand that those claims may be, coming more frequently and impacting a larger land area in what is now the state of Oklahoma. I'll say that, counseling a home buyer or a land buyer to help them to understand that this case doesn't impact their ability to own property is really important to help allay those fears. And, there are a lot of resources that folks can look at. There are just tons and tons and tons of pieces of information. You can go out on the internet and Google the McGirt case. You can find videos of a bunch of us talking to each other on screens, looking like the Brady Bunch, talking about this case, because we've all gotten together quite a bit to put out as much information as we can, CLEs for our attorney friends, and then just kind of community caucusing for people to get a better understanding of this. So definitely avail yourselves of the resources that are available out there on the internet. And frankly, if folks have questions about how real estate's going to be treated inside of a reservation boundary, I encourage folks to call the tribe itself and talk to their realty office and, get an understanding of how the tribe views its own real estate functions, because those are sovereign governments that operate their own realty departments, much like what you'd see on the state side or even on the federal side. So the tribes are always a good resource to visit with.
I love that. It's, sometimes when you hear media stories, so for example, right after this case came down, there was some discussion of the attorney general and the tribes getting together to, negotiate some issues. And then some of those negotiations fell apart, and it can start to look like to, those of us that are out here just kind of watching from the sidelines, that it's very contentious, and you have to be careful that, sometimes that portrayal is that, well, the tribes are just out for their own interest and they're going to, come try to do something. And that's not the case at all. I mean, obviously, yes, they are tribal members and they're tribal nation, but they're also Oklahomans, and we all want what's best for the state of Oklahoma and everybody that lives here. And so those kinds of stories will come up, right? They'll be negotiating certain points. Things may fall apart. They'll come back together. But like you said, using the tribe as a resource and having those conversations, I think that's a really, really good piece of advice.
Yeah, and I might just add to that same kind of path. When we think about the tribes and the state coming together to try to negotiate some understanding or some agreement, we have a long history of doing that very successfully here in the state. I can point to dozens and dozens and dozens of subject matter areas where the tribe and the state have come together to basically address the concerns that are present not only for tribal citizens, but also for non-tribal folks here in Oklahoma. We've got cross-deputization agreements where tribal law enforcement and local law enforcement work together to maintain safety inside of a reservation-based community or inside of a tribal community. You've got agreements between the tribes and the state as it relates to taxes, sales tax. You've got agreements on car tags. You've got agreements on hunting and fishing rights. So there's a great relationship between the tribes and the state in so many different areas. So if there are things to be worked out between those two sovereigns, I have every confidence that the tribes and the state will be able to come to a solution that meets the needs of all of Oklahomans, not just the tribal members or the non-tribal members.
Well, Casey, that was phenomenal information. I have learned a lot. I have no doubt that our members are going to find this extraordinarily valuable, and I think is going to alleviate a lot of concerns for people that they just didn't understand kind of what direction things were going in, what the status of things were. And so you are obviously very knowledgeable on this. And I thank you so much for dedicating a little bit of your time to us so that we could have this discussion about this fascinating case and this very interesting issue that is kind of unique to the state of Oklahoma.
Well, thank you all for having me.
Nabil, I thought that was awesome, and I completely just ran right over you and didn't let you ask any questions. That was very rude of me, but what did you think of that? Because, we talked about this, that you didn't take an Oklahoma history class. I mean, I'm really interested in your hot take after hearing all that.
Yeah, I was actually, we kind of talked beforehand, and I was just like, you're gonna take this topic. And it was great because I was learning so much when Casey was giving us the perspective and the history and the background of everything, that I was just getting lost in that content and thinking about it and processing it. And so I think it's going to be very, very helpful to a lot of people that might not have that historical knowledge or that background on, how even that reservation was checkerboarded and then kind of sold off, and how everything just transpired, right? Because like you said, haven't taken an Oklahoma history class. So I think this is a major part of Oklahoma history.
Absolutely. It's a huge part. Like she said, I remember growing up, I had to take an Oklahoma history class, but I really think it was like in 7th grade. So being a lifelong Oklahoman, you're almost just barely even exposed to it in school. You get 1 year of it when you're fairly young. And again, they don't cover it in the depth that really gives you that background knowledge that it's a complex history that we have here. It's very complex. It's sometimes very ugly, and throughout it's very fascinating and interesting. So this is just like one little piece of it that again, we're now seeing like continue to develop, right? Like this is what's so fascinating, is that we're talking about reservations that were formed well over 100 years ago. that should have been disestablished in a certain way that weren't. And now here we are in 2020, and that's creating these new implications. I just think that is a fascinating look into just one little piece of Oklahoma history, and of course how that affects real estate. And in this case, very little, which is good news for our realtors, but certainly we'll have clients and things like that that may be curious about it. So man, I'm so glad she was able to come on and share that info with us.
Right. Such a wealth of knowledge. And I mean, we just said that things that were done 100 years ago are now kind of resurfacing and exposing some things. So I'm like fascinated at how this is going to evolve in the next, decade, because it's not going to happen tomorrow, right? But she's saying that this is already being used as a precedent for other cases. But like in the next decade, like how this is going to impact the future of land, and like she was saying, this is mainly just for criminal jurisdiction right now. But it could kind of stem off of something else, right? Like other things might get exposed. It'll be fascinating to see.
Absolutely. So, man, we hope that all of our listeners found that valuable. Please share this with somebody if you thought that it was interesting. We know that you've got another realtor friend or colleague in your life that would also find it interesting. So please share so that we can help spread this information about what's going on with this McGirt case and how that may impact real estate. And please keep coming back week after week.
That's right. And if you have any questions or comments, you can email them to us, podcast@OKRealtors.com. We love hearing from our listeners.
Absolutely. And until next time, we'll see you next Tuesday on Talking Real.